What if 5 ordinary young men drove home after a basketball game and never truly came back? What if their disappearance wasn't marked by violence, no witnesses screaming for help, no clear signs of struggle, but instead by silence, confusion, and choices that make no sense even decades later? On a cold February night in 1978, under a moonlit sky in Northern California, 5 friends vanished into the mountains. What was later discovered would leave investigators baffled, families devastated, and the public asking the same question to this day. How could 5 men disappear together, only to leave behind a trail of clues that feel deliberately wrong? This is the unsettling mystery of the Yuba County Five. In February of 1978, the United States was a very different place. Small towns still trusted familiarity, routines mattered, and communities felt tight-knit. In the town of Yuba City, California, 5 young men lived lives defined by structure and predictability. Gary Mathias, Jack Hewitt, Bill Sterling, Ted Wire, and Jack Madruga were not adventurers, thrill-seekers, or risk-takers. They were creatures of habit. Each of them had mild intellectual disabilities or mental health challenges. And because of that, their families were deeply involved in their daily routines. They worked steady jobs, lived at home or with caregivers, and followed rules closely. Deviating from plans caused anxiety. These were not men who improvised easily. On the evening of February 24, 1978, everything about the night seemed normal. The 5 friends attended a basketball game at California State University in Chico. They were passionate fans, especially of the Special Olympics team they supported. The game ended without incident. Witnesses saw them laughing, celebrating, buying snacks. They were in good spirits. Their plan was simple: drive back to Yuba City, get some rest, and the next morning head out early for a Special Olympics basketball tournament they were scheduled to play in. For these men, this tournament mattered. It was a big deal. They had prepared for it. Family members later emphasized that none of them would willingly do anything to jeopardize that commitment. Jack Madruga was driving his Mercury Montego, a car he was extremely protective of. He rarely let anyone else touch it. The group left Chico around 10 p.m. That should have been the end of the story. A short drive home, familiar roads, routine preserved. But sometime after leaving Chico, something changed. Instead of heading southwest toward Yuba City, the car went east, climbing into the Plumas National Forest. This was not a scenic detour. This was not a shortcut. It was the opposite direction. The road became darker, colder, more isolated. Snow covered the ground. Temperatures dropped below freezing. For reasons never explained, the car kept going deeper into the mountains. Days later, when the Mercury Montego was found, it sat abandoned on a remote mountain road, stuck in snow, but otherwise undamaged. The fuel tank was not empty. The battery worked. The car could have been pushed free. There was no sign of a crash, no blood, no struggle, no indication that something forced the men to stop. The doors were unlocked, windows rolled up. It looked deliberately parked, as if someone made a choice to leave it there. This is where the mystery truly begins. Why would 5 men, afraid of the cold, unfamiliar terrain, and breaking routine, abandon a working car in freezing conditions? Why would Jack Madruga, who loved that car, leave it behind? Why would any of them step into the snow, wearing light jackets and sneakers, with no survival gear? Search efforts began quickly once families realized the men never returned home. At first, authorities assumed the group had gotten lost or stranded and would be found nearby. But days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Then, months later, the story took a darker turn. In early June of 1978, as snow melted in the mountains, searchers discovered something horrifying. Nearly 20 miles from where the car was found, inside a remote Forest Service trailer, they found the body of Ted Wire. He was lying on a bed, wrapped in sheets. He had lost nearly 100 pounds. His beard had grown long. Evidence showed he had survived for weeks, possibly months, after disappearing. There was food in the trailer, military rations, enough to keep him alive. but they had barely been touched. This detail haunts the case. Ted Weiher was described as gentle, anxious, and extremely rule-oriented. He may not have opened the food because it wasn't his, because it was sealed, because no one told him it was allowed. Investigators believe he slowly starved to death, surrounded by food he didn't feel permitted to eat. Nearby, searchers found the remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling. Their bones were scattered, likely disturbed by animals. They had died from exposure. Further along the path, closer to the car, was Jack Madruga. His body lay beneath a tree. Gary Mathias, however, was never found. To this day, his fate remains unknown. The distances involved are staggering. The men walked miles through deep snow at night in freezing temperatures, without proper clothing. There were no clear tracks explaining their route, no clear reason explaining their direction. It's as if logic dissolved the moment they left the car. Theories have poured in for decades. Some believe Gary Mathias, who struggled with schizophrenia but was reportedly stable at the time, experienced a psychotic episode and convinced the others to follow him. Others argue that makes no sense, as Gary was the most capable of survival among them, and yet he is the one who vanished completely. Some suggest they encountered someone on the road, something frightening enough to force them into the mountains. But no evidence supports an attack or threat. Another theory suggests military involvement, strange lights in the sky, or even UFOs. Witnesses reported seeing lights that night, but those claims are inconsistent and unverified. Still, the complete lack of a rational explanation leaves space for speculation. What remains most disturbing is not what we don't know, but what we do. These men did not behave randomly. They didn't panic in a way that aligns with survival instincts. They didn't make choices that align with fear or desperation. Instead, they made choices that feel constrained by obedience, confusion, and psychological vulnerability. Imagine Ted Weiher alone in that trailer. Cold nights, hunger, silence, food within arm's reach, but untouched, waiting for permission that would never come, waiting for friends who were already gone. Imagine Gary Mathias, somewhere in those mountains, walking into darkness, never found. Did he survive longer than the others? Did he leave intentionally? Did he encounter something no one else did? The Yuba County Five is not just a mystery of disappearance. It is a case study in how fragile routine can be, how vulnerable trust can be, and how the human mind responds when structure collapses. These were not reckless men. They were careful, and that makes their fate even more unsettling. To this day, families still ask the same questions. Why did they leave the car? Why did they go up the mountain? Why didn't they turn back? Why didn't Ted eat the food? And why was Gary never found? There is no official conclusion, no satisfying answer, only fragments of a story frozen in time, scattered across the mountains of Northern California. The case remains open in spirit, if not in paperwork. And perhaps that is what makes the Yuba County Five so disturbing. Not the idea that something violent happened, but the possibility that nothing did. That confusion, fear, and silence were enough to lead 5 lives into oblivion. So when you think about this case, ask yourself, if routine is the only thing holding order together, what happens when it breaks? And if 5 men can vanish without a single clear answer, how many other stories remain unfinished, waiting in the dark for someone to ask the right question? Because somewhere in those mountains, the truth still exists, buried, silent, and unresolved.